Hello, everyone. I'm Haley from ProWritingAid. Thank you so much for being with us today. We are joined tonight by Camille Perri, who is the author of the novels The Assistants and When Katie Met Cassidy, both of which have been optioned for feature films with her attached as screenwriter. Camille is a former editor at Cosmopolitan and Esquire, and her essays on queer identity and culture have been widely published. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from New York University, where she majored in English and Gender and Sexuality Studies, and a Master's of Library Science degree from Queens College. So Camille, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And hey, everybody. Nice to see so many people here in that chat. It's very exciting.
Yes, we're so excited to have you all. So I'd love to just kick off learning a little bit about your history and background as a writer. And just, did you always want to be a writer, and kind of how did you start off learning how to write?
Always wanted to be a writer. It's the only thing I've ever wanted to be. I did recognize the need to try to have a real job.
Yes.
After college. I majored in English, actually double majored in English and gender studies at NYU. But I came from, a middle-class family, took out a lot of loans to go to college. So, my two older sisters, one's an accountant and one's a teacher. So we're practical people. So I became a librarian. That's what I became because I worked as a library page all through high school and thereafter. I loved libraries, and I thought, well, what greater place to work and be surrounded by books all the time and be inspired by the written word than to be a librarian. So I became a librarian. And the whole time I was doing that job, I was always writing in my free time, weekends, days off, whenever I could. It wasn't until years later that I ended up then getting into sort of the magazine world, and worked as an assistant in magazines, and then got more into covering books as part of my job. But I always knew that I wanted to be a writer, and I was sort of like, I had this single-minded purpose. Like I always knew that's what I wanted to do. And I would make whatever sacrifices it kind of took to get me there. And, for the most part, it's paid off. I think I'm doing okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I went to Barnard, and I definitely feel the pain of going to school in New York City and the loans and the expense that costs. Yes. So I also went a very practical route solely for that purpose after. But I'm curious, do you feel like any of the things that you learned as an English major in your kind of undergraduate training, did you feel like that was immediately applicable into writing as you started to do that more seriously? Or do you feel like you ended up kind of learning more on the job, learning more you to write and that type of thing?
I think everything served its own purpose. I think having been an English major, I chose that because I thought, well, maybe I'll be an English teacher. I chose it because I'm really bad at math. And I knew I couldn't do anything that involved numbers. So, and I just enjoyed it. I wanted to read the texts that I would have to read. I wanted to be graded based on papers that I wrote rather than, exams or like, I don't know what they do in the sciences, like practical. I don't even know. Like I knew whatever it was, I couldn't do it. I do think that I don't by any means think it's necessary, but I think that one thing that it gave me was sort of a foundation of like the quote unquote canon. And beyond that, the electives that I took, which were way more interesting, where I took the African-American novel and was exposed to, that's when I first read Toni Morrison and James Baldwin. And, the electives that I chose, I think really exposed me to a lot of stuff that I might not have found if I was just left on my own. They say like, well, what do you need to go to college for? You got a library card, but I do think there's something to be said for, getting handed these texts and then having to talk about them. And I also think it does something for your confidence in a way. Having had that background, I think whether or not it's valid, you feel a little bit more confident, like you have some sort of credibility. Well, I have a degree in English, you know, I've read Chaucer, you know, like
Yeah.
it helps you feel, or it helped me anyway, feel a little bit more confident. I don't know whether that was real or not. But regarding sort of schooling versus on the job, I definitely learned, in terms of hardcore writing, I learned a lot more by doing. So when I was working in magazines and covering books, I was hearing people talk about books in a very different way than I had previously. So you're in these rooms and you're talking about books with people where maybe books aren't that important to them, or maybe it's not the most important thing for a magazine that needs to make money and have advertising and stuff like that. So I started to learn how people who didn't necessarily love books talked about them and thought about them. And I think that actually helped me in a way, because it made me a little bit less, it took some veils away from my eyes a little bit. Like it made me realize the commercial side that isn't always the most fun to think about if you're coming to it as an artist, a creative, someone who's very sensitive. But I think it helped me a lot, at least find my voice and my track, to think about that commercial side and what I actually wanted to do and who would be reading it and how I would sell it.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. So I technically now work in marketing, which is not something that I would have ever said like, oh, I'm going to work in marketing, but I feel really thankful for it, because I think working in marketing, or just becoming familiar with, like you said, how people talk about things and how the people who control the money like categorize things, I think helps you think. And I can see how this would apply to fiction writing as well. Like helps you think about categories of marketability. So like these are the different genres, right? Like approaching it as like, okay, I know that I have this story that I want to tell, but when it comes to pitching this to people, or when it comes to getting a readership, it helps to kind of know the neat category that it fits into. So you can say, oh, it's like this, these are the types of people who would want to read this, and maybe makes that pitching process a little bit easier. And also I think maybe backs up to making your book process easier, because you're like, okay, I know that I'm writing for these folks, in a way that's really interesting. So you mentioned that writing on the kind of actual act of writing has been really helpful. And before we started the session, you were mentioning that during the pandemic, you've been working on a third book, but you have kind of thrown out a couple books in the process. So I'd love to like dig into that a little bit more. How do you kind of, I guess my first question is like, how do you know when an idea is worth pursuing? Or on the flip side, how do you know when to throw it out, or when it's time to kind of go back to the drawing board?
I mean, I feel like I should preface this by saying I'm not positive about any of this. I don't want to come off as an authority really, because you would think that having written one book and then having written another book, that I would like really feel like I totally know what I'm doing at this point, and I don't. It's the same every time. It's almost like you start all over every single time you sit down to write a new thing. So I'm not so super confident that the things that I threw out needed to be thrown out. Other than that, they can always be retrieved, right? If nothing's ever really thrown out anymore, right? Like I threw these things out, you know. For one thing, for me, I have one trusted reader that I trust beyond anyone in the world, more than my agent, more than my editors, and it's my wife. And my wife is my reader. When I show her something, this is the person who loves me more than anyone else in the world, and who wants me to be happy, and who wants to support me, and who wants me to succeed more than anyone else in the whole world. So when she tells me this isn't working, I know that that's true. And and you need someone in your life like that. I mean, it's hard to find, but if you could find someone in your life who's going to be honest with you, not overly critical, or someone who you know has your best interest in mind 100%. And that can be tricky. Writers groups don't always necessarily provide that. There could be a lot of competition in there, or politics, or different stuff. So you have to find that person. But I think that person is a good guiding light, but I also think it comes down to you. You have to listen to your own gut. So if Helen tells me, I don't think this is working, and then I go through whatever notes she made, and I have this ring of truth, where I'm like, yeah, that's, yeah, Now, if I had a very different reaction where I was like, no, she's wrong, and here's why she's wrong, and I could make that argument, then I've only doubled down on knowing that I'm on the right track, but I didn't have that with these projects. So we'll see. I'm working on a new thing now, and in a couple of weeks, maybe I'll have something strong enough to show her, and we'll see where I'm at with that. But I think it's hard to know when you're working on something that you need to let go. I think it's a really hard thing to know. My first book really took me 6 years to write. I always believed in the idea. The execution was here and there. There were, lots of false starts, lots of rewrites. And, I really had faith in the idea, and the execution wasn't always there, but I knew I could kind of get it there. So I think if you feel really strongly that your idea works and you feel it, stick with it. I also think if you're not totally sure and you're only sticking with it because of time that you've already invested, and you feel like, well, I already spent all this time on it, and it's not your only shot. Most people, I think, who get published have loads of stuff that they've given up on or put aside or is in a drawer somewhere prior to that. I mean, I certainly do, loads of stuff that I thought this is going to be my book. This is it. And it's probably not. I mean, it might be, but it doesn't have to be. And it's not a sign of anything bad if it's not. It could be your writing process. It could be your learning process book. And then it's not like you didn't need to go through all of those steps to get to your book. So it's not time wasted. It's time used,
Yeah. I love that, because I think I've seen throughout the chat and in our Facebook group, a lot of people worried about that kind of like sunk cost of, I have spent a lot of time on this, I put it out there. The idea that whether it's, we've had some people who are self-publishing on Wattpad or just in different places and saying it's up on Amazon, I'm afraid to take it down because I've put it out there. And I think it's just so important to remember that process, all of the things you learned on that road are not wasted time. I really love that, because I think it's so hard to be like, well, I did this, and it stinks to put it in a drawer somewhere and return to it later, or to admit, it's hard to admit that it might need more work. But I love approaching it as just a learning process. And I think it's also, I really loved what you said about your relationship with your wife and being able to have someone who is both has your best interest at heart, but then is also not afraid to be objective. And I think that is such a great advice, because sometimes we find people who have your best interest at heart, but are afraid to be objective or something like that. So I really think those two pieces are both so important. Yeah.
It's hard to do that for other people, and if someone else shows you their work, you don't want to break someone, you don't want to break their soul. You don't want to hurt them, so you always try to be constructive, but, you want to be honest too, because you're not really helping anyone by, saying something you don't mean just to sound encouraging when maybe they're running, full speed ahead in the wrong direction. You're not doing anyone any favors if you do that. So.
Yeah, definitely. So can you talk a little bit about your overall process? So do you start with character? Do you start with idea? And then once you have that, kind of or like character within an idea, and then where do you kind of go from there?
I think, I feel like it's equal parts character and idea. It might be idea. I like to keep a folder. I like to keep a folder of ideas that I just kind of get. If I get just a weird little thought, I'll throw it into a folder, and then every once in a while, I'll just kind of go through that folder.
Yep.
If I'm looking for a new idea. And a lot of times what I'll then try to do is see how the different things that I've thrown in there might connect, so you can kind of group a few ideas into one, but once you have the idea, I think character really is almost the most important thing. I think they're equal. I think those are the two big ones. Voice is really important. With the assistants, I sold that book on its voice. When the editor who originally took a chance on me, she had read it, handed it back to us and said, I have some ideas on the work that this needs, and if you're willing to put in this work, submit it back to me. If you're not, you might be able to just keep everything as is and go somewhere else and have them. And so what I chose to do was take it, worked another 3 months on the book using her sort of ideas and going back to her. But the one thing that she had said was the voice alone on this. Like, she's like, your plot is kind of all over the place and going off the rails. But the voice alone is what makes this book. So having someone tell me that gave me a lot of faith in that I was doing something right. And it's almost like if you've got the voice and you've got character, plot's so much easier to fix, like that's a matter of, it's almost like plugging in, you start getting, well, what's going to happen on, you've got your thing and you're like, okay, well, this is page 25 and this is my midway point. And, so plot, it's almost like, I think character and voice, and I think those two go hand in hand. That's it. Yeah.
That's such great advice. And it's comforting because I feel like I've had a couple ideas where I have characters in mind that I'm thinking through, and I go back and forth on like what I want to happen to them, which I think is like then comforting because it's like, okay, as long as I know who the character is and kind of the arc, then plot can come almost like the outline of what happens, and the sequence can kind of come later. And someone in the chat asked, or someone in the FAQ asked, do you tend to outline a lot first before you go in and start writing?
I do. I did some ghostwriting early on in my career. I ghostwrote some novels for Alloy Entertainment. You might know them from like Gossip Girl and Vampire Diaries and all those, those books, the series books. The one thing I learned from that experience was I would get outlines from them, and then I would have to write the books. So I got used to writing off of a very precise outline, in-depth outline. And I really felt like that was useful. I felt like it really helped me to have all that stuff figured out. And then you could kind of just go crazy, and that you could kind of riff on it, and it was like freeing in a way. But in terms of outlining, I always think it's really important to remember that it's just like kind of a guide, and you're going to probably change it. Like, you don't have to stick to it too much, because then that could be stifling. But that's really a personal thing, though. I mean, there are some people who just cannot outline, and there are people who really like outlining. And I think like once you figure out which one of those people you are, you're going to know like clearly. I think like it's just one of those things. It's like you're either left-handed or right-handed, and you can force yourself to be the other, but it's going to be a little bit messy.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I'm curious how you got started ghostwriting, because it feels like that would be such a great way to practice. I think one of the things, when you're writing on a passion project or something for yourself, it might be hard to stick to deadlines. So it's like, ghostwriting, where you have the incentive of pay and established deadlines might be helpful for some folks. So yeah, how did you get into that?
I sort of got into it by accident. I was trying to write YA novels at the time. I was an assistant at Esquire, and a friend that I met through Esquire connections introduced me to this person, because they were like, oh, you're trying to write a YA novel. Well, so-and-so who used to work here writes YA novels. You guys should go out for coffee. And we went out for coffee, and I told her, I was trying to get this YA novel published, and she very kindly offered to make an introduction to her editors. her editors were at Alloy Entertainment. So I sort of showed them my work in hopes that they would want to publish it, which they did not. but they said, well, we really think you're, you know, we like what you can do. Would you be interested in doing some ghostwriting for us? You know, and so I said, okay, you know, and it was interesting because I'm writing in someone else's voice. So what was cool about that is, you know, it didn't have my name on it. And so I felt less anxious in a way.
Yeah.
And it felt like, well, I'm writing as this other person, I'm writing in this other voice. It felt a little bit less personal. And it was good for someone who's just starting out. I think it was good because I was a little bit less nervous about what would happen, you know. The stakes felt a little bit lower, but I mean, the pay wasn't great, and I mean, it wasn't the best gig in the world. I'm glad that I did it. It was like writing boot camp, but it was also many years ago, and I don't know. I can't really advise anybody on if they want to head up Alloy and try to get a ghostwriting gig these days. I have no idea like what they're doing.
I love what you said though about it being, if that is something that's, you know, anybody can find, it's interesting to think about it as kind of writing boot camp. And then also that there's something a little bit less personal about it. It's like, it's not your idea necessarily, you know, there's all these other kind of pieces where it just allows it to be more like a straight up job, I think, in a way that like, it's not, it's just not as hard. Like I write every day for work and I don't take feedback on that work personally, but I do on like, you know, passion project kind of fiction ideas.
Right.
I would love to talk a little bit about genre. So you started off trying to write in YA, and then When Katie Met Cassidy is very romance novel. So kind of how have you charted what, and I'm not really sure, how would you talk about The Assistants in terms of genre? I know it's been described as like When Ocean's 11 meets Devil Wears Prada. So kind of like contemporary fiction, or...
The Assistants, for anybody who's not familiar, it's a novel about a group of assistants who use their billionaire boss's expense account to pay off their student loan debt. So it's sort of a heist book. Some people, what's funny about that book is it really was just contemporary fiction or women's fiction because it has two female protagonists and it's a little bit feminist. So it got a pink cover and was called women's fiction. That was fine with me. But it was really embraced by the crime community in a way, because it does have a crime at its heart, at its center. They are embezzling money. It wasn't intended to be a crime book, but it definitely, you know, brushes up against that. With Katie Met Cassidy, I knew from, you know, I knew I wanted it to be a queer rom-com. Like that's what I knew I wanted to write. And I knew I wanted to very much be in that genre. So that was like definitely like I wanted to really write like a classic romantic comedy in the sense of like what a romantic comedy book should do, you know?
Yeah. So why? What inspired you to write within that genre?
Well, I really felt like there wasn't a whole lot of queer representation that I felt had really hit the mainstream enough. I know that there are loads of small presses and all sorts of options for people who are looking for it. If you want to, you know, find it, you'll find it. But I felt like I was in a pretty unique position in that my first book was Penguin Random House. It was Putnam. It's a major publisher, and it did done fairly well. And so I knew when I was going to pitch my second book, it felt like this was my shot to try to get a major publisher to you know, come out with a queer rom-com. And I knew that I really wanted a masculine of center queer lead. You know, I knew that with the Cassidy character that I really wanted to, you know, do a lot of gender stuff in there that I could kind of slip in, you know, to where, you know, I wanted this to be a book that readers of my first book, The Assistants, would come to, and you know, they're not necessarily queer readers. They're not necessarily even romance readers. They might just be people who, you know, read, you know, whatever they see on, you know, the skim or whatever, you know, and because they were like, oh yeah, I remember that one. I like that other book. Let me pick this one up. So I kind of, in a way, maybe naively thought it was sort of a social activist, socially conscious sort of drive to put a book like this into the mainstream. And I think I don't know whether or not anything ever moves the needle. I don't know, but that was my intention for it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there started to be more queer romance novels. Like I think Casey McQuiston stuff kind of comes to mind, where there's just a lot more coming out recently that I am aware of, that I've seen, that are in that kind of mainstream, just like you were talking about, that aren't from like smaller presses. They're, they're all over Book Talk, are all these kind of queer romances. So I definitely think it's really important to move the needle that way. And I think that, I've read a ton of romance in preparation for this week. And I think a couple of things that stood out about your book specifically were, first, so I think in a lot of ways, romance novels have a pretty predictable plot in some way. Like, that we're going to get to the happily ever after. We know that there's going to be some complications, etc. I found two of the things that I found really unique about your book were, first, the place of the Met, which, for those who aren't familiar, the Met is the kind of bar where it's a lesbian bar where Cassidy, one of the main characters, is, or the main kind of romantic lead, or romantic interest rather. It's like almost her surrogate family, I think. And it really stuck out to me because I found in most of my romance novel readings, the settings are like just totally interchangeable. Like it's like it could have taken place literally anywhere. And so the Met specifically really stuck out as a place. And then also the kind of the characters at the Met stuck out. I feel like in most of romance novels that I've read, the main character or the love interest, they have like one or two friends who are kind of there. And there's like a really large cast of characters at the Met who end up playing a significant role in their conversations with both Katie and with Cassidy, of course. And so I just love to hear a little bit about how you kind of conceptualized the Met, and also the kind of supporting cast of characters that's there really to support Cassidy, but also interacts with Katie as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. I felt like place was really important. And I really wanted to depict a lesbian bar, or a queer bar, because there are so few of them, particularly lesbian bars. And just so I mean, when I say lesbian bar, they are also open to all genders. I mean, when I say lesbian bar, I mean not a gay male bar, cis gay male bar. There are a lot of those in major cities. There are very few spaces for lesbians and other gender nonconforming people that maybe don't want to go to a rave or whatever. Yes. These sort of small bars that are almost like your Cheers. It's a dying thing. It's just there's not a lot of them anymore. And so I wanted one of those in there because that's the kind of place I used to go to when I was in my 20s, and loved and felt really welcomed in. And I want I want young people to have that. And so it was important for me to depict that space. But regarding what you said in terms of Katie and Cassidy, one thing that I did really specifically in the book, which is not necessarily something you see in a whole lot of traditional romance novels, is that with the point of view, with the POV, what I did was, it's third person close, alternating between Katie, Cassidy. So you're getting both of their points of view. So there are some people who are going to come to the book and just right off the bat, Katie's going to be their anchor character, and that's who they're going to see themselves in. Someone who maybe, doesn't have a whole lot of prior, exposure to queer characters or queer spaces. And then other people might come to the book and just see themselves in Cassidy, and really that will be their anchor character. So I did that so that two very different kinds of people can come to the book and see themselves in it. And I think that helped with with sort of rounding out both of their characters, because you're kind of getting into both of their heads equally. They're equals in the book. They're co-leads, really.
Yep. Yeah, that's fascinating, because I was thinking, Michelle and I were talking about the book earlier, because Michelle has read The Assistants and I've read When Katie Met Cassidy, and I was talking about how I had wondered if Katie's characterization was intentional, and it makes a lot of sense for you to for you kind of describing her as an audience surrogate for someone who is not super familiar with the queer scene, with what a lesbian bar would be like, because she is she's a novice to all of that. Like, this is her first time experiencing all of that. And that's just like such a smart thing, because I think there's so much advice out there about creating your characters as surrogates, and they are really kind of polar opposites in a lot of ways in terms of their experience and their comfort and familiarity in the queer, like, lesbian world in New York. And now I'm like, oh, well, that's why you did that. That's so smart. That makes a ton of sense. And truly, for anyone, first of all, I highly recommend Camille's books. So definitely, I think I saw a couple people in the chat say they were going to order them. I would highly recommend them.
Thank you.
Really good. And I really, like, after I finished reading your book, there was the romance between Katie and Cassidy was great, but I was like, I've got to find a bar that has barbecues. Like, I was like, this is like I need the, like, barbecue scene. I was just like, that is what I'm missing right now. Like, I really want that Cheers bar where I can go and have people know me and cook me good food and all that type of thing.
Yeah, we all need that. We all need that.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple questions in the chat while we're kind of specifically talking about representation. So someone has said that they've heard comments in queer-oriented writing spaces that romance writers need to be careful they're not fetishizing LGBTQ plus identities. And do you have any perspective on what it means to fetishize gay or lesbian characters and relationships in writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's an issue that's valid. I'm sure there's better people to talk on this than me. From a writer's perspective, I just think as long as you are approaching your characters and you want to give them humanity and dignity, and they're not being used as props, I think it's a good way to hedge against fetishization.
Yeah.
Yes. It's the kind of thing where, like, when you see it in a way, it's hard to quantify, but I think as long as you're, as a writer, if you're approaching your characters in a way that you really want to make them whole, and your intentions, I mean, good intentions are not always the answer. It's a lot of times people have good intentions and do terrible things. But I think it's a good start, at least when you're writing. And in terms of that, I think, if you have people reading your work and someone brings up, something like that, just be open to it, hear them out, and then kind of decide for yourself, what you think, whether you need to go back into the text and rework some stuff, and maybe you had blind spots that you didn't realize that you had, and we're all learning every day, and it's okay if you mess up, and it's okay even if you offend someone, if you're willing to make it right and learn from it, and try to expand your understanding of what's happening there with your character or your story.
Yeah. And I think it's such important advice, and it applies obviously for representation, for gender identity, for like sexual orientation, for race, all of these types of things. I think it's so important to be open to that feedback, because even as a member of a specific community, that community is not a monolith. And so a different member might have a different perspective. And I think it's just important for all of us to remember that if someone's bringing something up, it's likely not it's from a place of wanting to help you. And even though it might feel like an attack, or it might feel like, oh my gosh, I worked so hard on this, it's embarrassing, or whatever that is, it's actually ultimately a learning opportunity, and it's an opportunity to edit your text the same way you would edit your text if a plot point didn't work, right? Like it's still about the like, how am I going into this text to make it better? And having realistic characters that ring true to the communities you're trying to represent is going to make your writing more effective. Just again, the same way that you would if you were writing, you know, if someone was giving you like your inciting incident doesn't work or something like that. It's very similar. And someone else asked, just quickly to continue on this thread, because I think it's something really helpful for a lot of folks. In terms of, so obviously Katie and Cassidy are the leads. Do you have any specific advice on writing minor characters? And kind of like I mentioned, Cassidy is surrounded by a large cast of characters who all do feel very real, and don't feel kind of token or anything like that. And so I was wondering if you had any advice on how to do that with secondary or minor characters.
Yeah, I think minor characters are really, really fun to write. I always find that when writing minor characters, you can kind of just let loose a little bit in a way that you can't with your main characters. Like the stakes are lower, and you can kind of play around with them a lot. I always find that minor characters come and go in my stuff too. Like I always start out with more minor characters than I end up with, because I realize that two could be combined into one, and I'm always like cutting minor characters as I go. But I think the main thing is with your minor characters is they each have to have a distinct voice and a way of speaking on the page. They should have certain tags. You know, you can't take for granted that everyone that's reading your book is paying the most 100% best attention. They might be reading fast. They might be reading on the subway. They might be at their kids', you know, gymnastics practice or whatever. So I always think in terms of accessibility with minor characters, sometimes you want to make it as easy on the reader as possible to distinguish between them, and to always know which one of them is talking. Like if you can sub out different minor characters' names for the same dialogue, that shouldn't work. You should know that, like if you can do that, that means they're talking too similarly, and you need to kind of distinguish it a little bit. But I think that's where you can really just have fun. Once you get their voices in your heads. I also think it's always fun to have certain minor characters at odds with each other. Arguments are always more fun to write or conflict is more fun to write than everyone just saying the same thing and getting along. So I think if you can play them off of each other and have them have differing opinions, it actually can create a sort of, well, not a Greek chorus, because the Greek chorus is just all saying the same thing, but like, you know, it's like point and counterpoint. And I think that keeps it really interesting, because your readers will then kind of be like, oh yeah, well, I think she does have a point, but you know, it's almost like, well, am I on team so-and-so or team so-and-so? You know, it keeps you active and engaged. The main thing you just want is your minor characters to always add and never take away. They should just be, like gravy, you know, they're adding to everything in a good way.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I know Mary in the chat was asking about how many are too many. And I think Camille's advice on like, if the voice is different, if they're adding something, I think that's like, if the characters are starting to sound the same, if they're starting to be interchangeable, that's probably a good indication that you might be able to cut one of those. And just before we move on from this, I saw someone in the chat asking if it was politically incorrect for a book's villain to be gay. And I think from my perspective, it's not politically incorrect to have anyone be anything, whether it's a villain, a hero, etc. I think it goes back to what Camille was saying about the character has to be well-rounded, right? The character can't be a cardboard cutout of what you think a gay villain is, you know, just like interchangeable, right? Like it has to be a real person with real flaws and motivations and goals that's recognizable. And if that's true, then, you know, your character can be gay, your character can be straight, your character can be non-binary, your character can be black, white, you know, whatever. And I think it's more about, are you doing the character justice in terms of, again, are they well-rounded? Do they have flaws? Do they have goals? Do they have things they're good at? And it's not just, okay, this kind of caricature of something. So, okay, there's a lot of questions on pitching. So I want to make sure we get to that, since a lot of folks have a lot of questions. So someone first asked if you would share a little bit about your experience of querying agents and how you initially got representation.
Yeah, um, I queried a few agents when I was working on the assistants. I used a cover letter, like a summary or outline, also could be called a pitch.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, I don't remember how many pages I had submitted, but I think it was like the first 3 chapters. When I sent to a few agents and didn't get very far, just kind of cold, going
Mm-hmm.
on, finding their contact information and just submitting. I think if there's any way that you can find a way around submitting cold to
Mm-hmm.
an agent, and by cold, I mean, having no connection to them at all. If you could find some connection where you get, someone maybe vouching for you, or just if you have a writer friend and you can ask them very nicely, how would you feel if I submitted to your agent? And then they could sort of tip their agent off and say, hey, my friend so and so is going to be submitting to you. What that does is it keeps you out of like the slush pile, which is just very
Mm-hmm.
long, and probably an assistant is going through as a filter before passing anything on to an agent to even let them see it. There's just there's so many people trying to get an agent and so many pages circulating that it's hard to know that you're actually going to be read if you just cold submit. So if you can get around that in any way, I think it's worth calling out your favors and trying whatever way that you can. The way I got my agent was, so I had told my former boss was the editor-in-chief of Esquire. His name was David Granger. The boss character in The Assistants is very much similar to him, not directly based on him, but he would tell you differently. He'd be like, you wrote that book about me. He was my boss. He was wonderful. I was no longer working there, but we kept in touch. We were out for dinner or drinks, and he asked how my writing was coming along. Everybody knew that I was, trying to write a book, trying to find an agent. And he gave a call over his daughter's boyfriend at the time, now husband, was an assistant at an agency, and he had asked him, oh, are there any agents there that you might think might be interested in taking a look at Camille's work? And I had not asked him to do this. He took it upon himself to do this. And then he was just like, so they're expecting your manuscript email, they're expecting your phone call. And I'm like, what?
What?
Like, excuse me? And the reason he did that is because I was like, oh, let me work on this a little longer. I was being really precious about it. And he recognized that. So he just pulled the Band-Aid off for me and was like, they're expecting your stuff, I probably would have waited another, I don't know how many months, year. I was treading water, and he was right to kind of kick me out of the nest that way. Now, maybe you don't have a David Granger in your life. That's okay. You don't need that. But maybe if you've noticed on yourself that you're hesitating too much and putting your work out there, pretend you have him in your life, saying, just send it out. And like, here's the other thing. There are a lot of agents out there. There are a lot of agents out there. So you might have your heart set on one. It might not be that one. And also be careful of going for a super agent, that one that everyone goes to, who's like the most important agent at, wherever. You probably don't want a super agent, because what you really need from your agent more than anything is your agent to call you back, email you back, and read your stuff. If you are the least important person on your agent's call list, that's not good. As fancy as it is to have a super agent, unless you are up there, you don't necessarily want that. So I would say shoot for someone who's young and hungry, looking for new talent, is going to fight like hell for you, and you guys can rise up together. That would be my advice.
Yeah, that's such good advice. And I feel I love what you said about your boss kicking you out of the nest. And I think a lot of people have have resonated with that. I think also, what you said about how your boss asked you about that because everyone knew you were writing. I feel like it's like, I just got to tell people, like, if all of us can tell the people in our lives first of all, we have no idea how many connections we might have. And then we have people who will ask. And I think like a lot of us write in silos or write and are afraid to tell anyone and that type of thing. And I feel like it's really helpful to just say it. Say, you know, there's no shame in being like, I want to be a writer. I'm working on this. And then maybe we all have your boss in our lives in some way.
Or you just never know. It could be like, you never know who knows who and who's willing to just, you know, it's not a huge thing for someone to say, you know, if someone has a connection to an agent, to just say, hey, like, just look out for this email coming in. It's not like you're not asking them for a kidney. You know, it's like, it's a thing people do for each other all the time. And generally people who work in this business, they've all been where you are right now, not you particularly, but where a new writer has been right now, and they want to pay it forward. Like if they're at a place in their life where they can do you a favor, they're going to do it, you know, unless you're just like a terrible person and they hate you. And then like, I can't help you. I don't know.
Hopefully I don't think any of us are terrible people. So everyone in the chat is just loving this and saying it's like so refreshing and inspiring, which is great. We only have a little bit of time left and I want to talk about, there's a lot of questions about the movie. So some people have asked, is there going to be a movie? And there's going to be two. I think both at least have been or hopefully both have been optioned. Hopefully there will be two movies. And I think to start, people just want to know, what was the day like when you found out that those had been optioned?
I mean, it was a dream come true, obviously. I mean, I love television and movies, and what I love even more than television and movies is books that become television and movies. Like, I mean, how much do you love reading a book and then seeing it on the screen and then tearing it apart and being like, well, this worked better here and this worked better here. That's just like a great hobby of mine. And so, of course, it was always a dream for that to happen. The assistants, yeah, I mean, Hollywood is a whole nother jungle, man. And I don't know, I would love to be able to tell you right now, both of them, you're going to see them on a screen coming near you. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. When Katie met Cassidy is with HBO right now, and the assistants is with a producer named Miranda Bailey, Cold Iron Pictures. And both of them are still sort of in the works. I've written scripts for both of them. I don't know for sure. Here's a little behind the scenes action. If you option your book, you're not necessarily going to write the screen adaptation, right? So you'll get a contract for that, which is the option contract, and then you sort of can pitch yourself as the writer of it, and that's the writer contract, right? And so I got that on both of them, but you can be fired at any time off your own project.
Oh my gosh.
The thing about Hollywood, as opposed to the book world, is that the writer's like the least important person involved. You know, you've got the director, it's a director's medium, producers, there's studios, you know, everything. There's all this stuff going on, and the writer is not necessarily particularly valued. I think they do kind of see you as getting fired as a writer in Hollywood is very, very common. Being rewritten is very, very common. You kind of have to be prepared for it. I have not been told yet by anyone that I have been fired on either project, but sometimes I heard that you could be fired in Hollywood and no one tells you until you find out someone else has written your thing.
Oh, no.
So, I don't know. I'm just working on my next thing and I'm hoping for the best. I want nothing more than to see both of those books on a screen. But I've done my part and now I just like have to hope and pray, basically.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's so exciting that, but that's so exciting for both of them. It's so exciting that when Katie met Cassidy is with HBO, because I feel like that's something that would really do the story justice in a way that's like very exciting. So that's so cool, but that's so stressful. I feel like in so many ways. So in that process of pitching, did you initiate that? Does it come through your agent? Kind of how did the genesis of at least the book part start? And then at what point did you come in and start to pitch yourself as the screenwriter on them?
So it's fairly common when you have a literary agent to a lot of agents sort of co-agent with agents in Hollywood who specialize in book to screen adaptation.
Gotcha.
So my what happened for me, and I think what's fairly common, is your book agent will often, when the manuscript, long before the book comes out and they have the manuscript in its final form, they'll try to bring a Hollywood agent on, a screen agent. And a lot of them have relationships already with either one person that they tend to work with, or maybe it will be a handful of people. So that's what happened in my case. Carrie Sparks, who's my agent, my book agent, sort of co-agents with me, with my screen agent, who's Dana Spector at CAA. So, I guess I could have gone with someone else, but they had this relationship, and it all works out. And most of what's nice about that is, sometimes it's hard to get a Hollywood agent on the phone, but if you have this person in between, so my book agent can kind of chase her and follow up and do a lot of that, so that I can kind of just focus on, writing and doing other stuff. But yeah, that kind of, when you cross that bridge, you will come to it. Hollywood is hungry for IP, and it's very, very common for books to get optioned. These days, a lot of things get optioned and don't get made. That's not so bad, because if they keep renewing the option, you keep getting paid. And that is nice. That's not a bad thing. Of course, you want to see it get made, but hey, if every 2 years you get a nice check in the mail because someone wants it, that's not so bad either.
I think people are saying that's definitely an option, or definitely an upside either way.
That's called passive income. Passive income.
Amazing. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of this. This has been so great. People have asked, where is the best way to find you? So Michelle has dropped links to Camille's Penguin Random House page where you can get her books. And definitely they're on Amazon. They're and I'm sure you can get them through small local bookstores as well. Please read them. They're both so good. But is there anywhere else you would like people to follow you?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm not great at it, but I'm on there. You can find me there. You can DM me there, and hopefully I'll see it. Sometimes I don't see DMs for a little while. I'm older than I look. I'm not great at social media, but I try. At Camille Perri, Twitter and Instagram. It's this face on my profile. Hit me up there. I'm happy to hear from you. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Yeah. And that's just a great last note, because we got Camille by DMing her on Twitter. So she follows, she definitely checks her DMs. We DM'd her and she responded. So that's great. And then also, I know a lot of people are always like, oh my God, I have to be really good at social media as an author. And I feel like actually that's comforting to know that like it can help, but also if you're not, it's not the end of the world. You'll do okay. Yes.
You'll do okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much for having you. Thank you everyone for coming. Please go buy Camille's books. You will not regret it. Follow her on Instagram and Twitter, and keep an eye out for hopefully these books to become movies or shows or something like that soon.
Thanks so much. Great talking to you, Haley. Appreciate your time.
Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye.